Hello and welcome to Retraining Racehorses. So what we're going to be talking about here is how you can retrain your off-the-track thoroughbred and set them up for success in whatever their future on-call career is going to be. Regardless of discipline, regardless of what you're going to do with that horse, that's what we're going to talk about. So a little bit of why I am teaching this, why I'm so passionate about it, why I might have a perspective that's worth listening to. So in terms of riding, I took my off-the-track horse, who you can see in that photo under the Why Me and also in that bottom right photo. So I took him as a 9-year-old. He was off the track. He had done one other event prior to me getting him, but really very, very little. He was still quite green. And I took him having done that one event, and we got all the way up to 5-star level eventing. We completed and actually placed multiple times at the Australian International 3-day event at 5-star level. We also jumped up to Grand Prix. We did up to medium/advanced level dressage. Aside from him, I've had other horses that I have then retrained and evented up to 2-star level, up to meter 30 show jumping. I've trained them up to, again, your medium level dressage. I've also retrained them and had them rehomed as pleasure horses, adult riding club horses, trail horses, therapy horses, pony club horses, show jumpers, dressage, endurance, polo, a whole range of different careers and disciplines and whatnot. So it really is a passion of mine. I've really have at this point worked with more than I can actually count. And as part of that, I'm actually newly a acknowledged retrainer with the QOTT program, which is something run by Queensland Racing in order to put thoroughbreds into, or racehorses, they include the standard breds, but in order to get them into their new homes as successfully as possible. Aside from that, I've also been coaching since officially 2006, but actually a few years before that when I was still at school and coaching a few riders down the road. I have also worked in racing yards. I've been a foreman at a race stable. I've been a stable hand. I've partly gotten myself signed off as a track work rider, though I haven't really pursued that. And I am also a body worker. I do rehab for things like kissing spine lamenesses, etc., as well as setting up racehorses for their future career and helping their body transition into whatever their next career is going to be. So this really is a passion project of mine. I really just adore thoroughbreds. I love their personalities, their work ethic, pretty much everything about them. And I actually love that they have been racehorses in the past. I think that that's actually something to their credit rather than something to their detriment. So we're going to go into that. So my first principle when it comes to retraining these racehorses is to start where you are. So to acknowledge what racehorses know and what they don't know. And I think sometimes we focus on what the racehorses don't know and we forget to acknowledge what they actually do know and to really work with that rather than against that. So I was taught when I was younger, and it's certainly something I believed, that all racehorses knew how to do was gallop. And it's really just not the case. So they know actually way more than I think we give them credit for. So, for example, some of the things that I can think of that they know that really benefit me when it comes to retraining them is they know how to lead, they know how to tie up, they know how to pick up their feet, they've been tacked up, unsaddled, they've been hosed. In terms of riding, they can go in walk and trot and canter in a roughly straight line, which having, ridden breakers and young warm bloods and horses like that, I can tell you is actually a huge asset. They can load onto trucks, they can be rugged, they can go on and off a walker in stables, in the paddock. A lot of them have been led off other horses. If you think of horses being ponied to the races, they have learned to cope in stressful situations. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more later. But essentially, it's something to remember that even if they haven't coped the level of that we think they should have coped, they have been in far more stressful situations than we are ever likely to put them in. And they've lived through that. Even if we don't think they've coped particularly well, they actually probably have. And the odds of us ever putting them in something similar is so low that I think that's really worth acknowledging. And then as part of that, they've had to deal with loud noises. So crowds and music and trucks and cars, they've had to deal with people who are really stressed or excited or nervous or whatever. They've had to deal with different people in their life. So different stable hands, plus the trainer, plus different riders. They've really coped with a lot and a lot of stressful situations that we may never put them in ever again. So I think it's really important to acknowledge these things and to acknowledge how we can actually work with that and to acknowledge our starting point, because really, to me, we treat these horses off the track as though they're an entirely different species. And the truth is, what they really are is a horse where we have the general gist of what their background has been. We have a general understanding of what they have been trained to do, how they've been trained to go, how their life has been so far. So if anything, it's not that they're a different species, it's just that we have a bit more information about them, as opposed to the hugely varied upbringing that a lot of other horses experience, where we may not know their history and we have no idea how they go, how they learn, how they've been trained, how they've lived, anything like that. And so to me, that's the really wonderful thing about taking horses off the track, is that we have at least a general understanding of how their life has likely been, what they're likely to know and understand, and we can work from that. So in terms of what they don't know, so one of the main things that we find is that we say, these horses are heavy, they are on the forehand, and they get strong. And the truth is that, that's the case. So for the vast majority of them, have been taught to lean into the bridle. It's actually seen as something that's good and beneficial and something that people want. And so then when we get on them and we try and take up a contact, all they know how to do is to lean into that. They've also gone on their forehand their entire life. So of course they do. That's something that we need to work on. They're obviously not trained to any great degree to stand still. They don't stand still in the tie-ups. They don't stand still while the rider gets on. They don't stand still while they're being ridden, unless it's at the end of their work. They are not used to people getting on from a mounting block or from the ground or with a stirrup in general. They're used to their riders being thrown onto their back, and usually they're walking away at that time. There are also sometimes, and this depends on the yard, but for a vast majority of them, they're not used to being led in just a head collar. So we tend to find that, yes, they are a little pushy. They might walk through the head collar just because they're used to having a bridle or a rearing bit while they're being led. And then you also have that they're not used to necessarily living in a herd. So while they probably would have grown up in a herd environment from when they were foals to when they were yearlings, since then it's actually highly likely that they've only been in stables or yards or individual paddocks. So that's something that we need to understand, that they don't necessarily know. Okay. So some myths about racehorses that I hear a lot: that they're broken, that they're either unsound of body or of mind, that they're hot, that they are poor doers, that they're skinny, they're hard to keep weight on, all of those sorts of things, that they have bad feet, that their feet will forever be a problem, that they only know how to gallop. We've already talked about that. That they're strong to ride. We've already talked about that as well. And that racehorses are only for the brave, the experienced, the professional, or the crazy. Now, to a certain degree, I actually agree with this. And it's something of a mission of mine to, for as much as I possibly can, to end that. Because my personal belief is that racehorses are really suitable for anyone who is willing to learn how to work with them. And so the reason that I'm so passionate about teaching people about racehorses is because, from what I've seen, the racing industry gets a bad rap for racehorses being retired and then instantly, off to the slaughterhouse. And yes, there is overbreeding and all of that. We don't have time to talk about that now. It is definitely a thing. But in my experience, where horses end up in sales, where they end up going to the doggers, where they end up in neglect, is from the home that they go to after racing. So they don't go directly from the trainers to this terrible future. There's usually a home in between, and that home is usually really well-meaning, but they take on a racehorse either because they believe that they can do better than they can, because the horse is cheap, because they think that they'll be able to work with the horse, etc. And what the truth is that they don't necessarily know what they're getting into. They don't necessarily understand the racehorse. They don't necessarily know how to work with them and train them. And so we end up with these horses ending up in poor futures. They get passed around, or they end up, in really bad situations like the sales or the doggers. So that's one of my personal passions, is the idea that we should be able to teach people how to train their own racehorse rather than relying on a few number of retrainers, where we then know that once the horse leaves, it still needs training from its future home. Or for people just buying these horses because they're cheap and then really not knowing what to do with them. So to address the first few, though, so this idea that they're broken, this idea that they all have injuries and ailments and that they'll never really be sound. And the truth is that I just don't see this. In my rehab work, in my competition, in my body work, I just don't see it. I see some horses with injuries, yes. I see some horses with arthritis and wear and tear, yeah, absolutely. But I don't see any correlation between the length of their career as a racehorse and that. I see just as many young, injured, warm bloods, Arabs, quarter horses, etc. I just don't see that it's different. And the only thing that I do see is that when we do have a horse that is raced for a longer period of time, that if they have stayed sound for those extra starts, for those extra years, it says to me that we're really unlikely to do anything with them that's going to make them unsound. It's that idea of, well, if that amount of racing couldn't break them, I'm probably not going to. And so for me, this is actually why I have a preference for the horses that race longer, that have had more starts, because I actually find them to be sounder. And going into the next one about them being hot, I actually find that they tend to be the quieter ones, because again, they've survived in those stressful situations and they've coped with it so well that they've even been able to be successful. They've been able to cope with it for years and years and years. And the only horses, if you think about it, those horses that do really well, that make a name for themselves, that are really successful, that have really long careers, they're the ones where when you see them being paraded before their race, they're the ones that just walk. They're not the ones that are jogging and sweating and going sideways and whatnot. They're the ones that just are calm. They might be a little excited, but they're not losing their mind. And that's what actually makes them successful. And that's what means that they can have this long career. So for me personally, I actually prefer the horses that have raced for a while. But on that note about that particular myth, the myth is that racehorses are hot, and the truth is that that has a whole lot more to do with lifestyle and circumstance and training than it does to do with the actual horse. So my personal belief is that, like humans, there are horses that are born that are more predisposed towards stress, and there are others that are born more predisposed towards being laid back. And I find that in every breed. And I just don't see that correlation between racing and that particular attribute. And I say this as a lot of them, yes, while they're in their race training, especially depending on how they're trained and how they're housed, we certainly do see that while they're in that environment. But when we take them out of that environment, I just don't see that. I have one in my paddock at the moment who, when he was racing and when he was in a stable, he used to kick and he used to bite and he used to be difficult to lead and all of these things. And from the moment that I've had him and he's lived in a paddock, it stopped. He absolutely is not hot or stressy or problematic at all. And it literally stopped the day that he went in the paddock. So that's where I challenge that one. Then we also have that racehorses are poor doers, that they're skinny, and that they have bad feet, because I'm going to put that into one topic. So essentially, again, this is just simply a case of how you work with them when they finish racing. Hooves can always be improved. Some horses, won't necessarily end up with as good a hooves as others. But when we talk about genetics, honestly, the only horses that actually have a proven genetic defect in hooves that is hereditary, that is passed down, is Connemara's. The rest of the breeds, it can be a personal thing, but in the case of racehorses, honestly, it's more to do with their lifestyle. It's the feed that they've been on, the way that they've been living, and the work that they've been doing, which means that when you change those things, we can change the hooves. They're not set in stone. They grow all the time. We can help them. Then you have the poor doer part of that. And honestly, rehabbing their gut after racing means that you essentially end up with a horse that doesn't necessarily require a lot of feed. Again, that same horse out of my paddock, as well as all the other horses out of my paddock, have grass, they have hay, and they have a small amount of pellets so that I can mix some minerals into it. That's what they eat. And they do really well on that. And again, that's, dependent on lifestyle, depends on where you can keep them and how you can keep them and all of those sorts of things. But I just, again, do not see that being true. So I think if we can let go of these myths and actually approach each horse as an individual and see what that individual horse needs rather than labeling them as a racehorse and therefore having these things, I think it's much nicer. It's much easier. Okay, so you've decided that you want to have a racehorse. So how do you go about actually choosing one and knowing whether you have one of these individuals that is predisposed to stress or to poor feet or to, not being a great doer or whatever? So first of all, honestly, if you don't know, if you're not sure, get help. Get someone who knows you, who knows what you need, who has experience in these sort of things. And most importantly, get someone who is willing to tell you no. So that if you see that pretty horse and you go, yep, that's the one that I want, you need to be taking someone with you who will go, no, that is not a good choice. Do not do it. And will stick by that, even if they know that they're hurting your feelings. So we can find a racehorse either directly from the trainer or the racing owners, or we can find them from someone who has retrained them or further down. But we're going to talk about those two. So if we're buying them from a retrainer, that's great because you can probably ride them when you try them. You can probably meet them multiple times. You can get a vet check. You can know a little bit more about what they might have aptitude in, what they might be suited to. You have someone who knows a bit about the horse and is hopefully quite experienced in retraining them. So they might be able to tell you something about the horse. You also get to see them out of that environment. So that horse that I used as an example, you would get to see him as a lovely, friendly, quiet horse rather than the bitey, kicky, hot horse that he was when he was in training. So you might get a bit of a clearer view about what the horse is actually like. I'm going to put a caveat on this, though, and say that, again, we still need to know what we're working with because the retrainer may have put a few weeks in, a few months in, whatever. But the point is that we actually have to continue that. That in itself is then not set in stone. We can't just rely on that training to last forever and the horse to just go that way. We still actually have to work ourselves. If you're getting the horse straight from the trainer, the advantage is that they're going to be much cheaper. Some of them are even going to be free. But the thing is, you're not going to get to ride the horse. You're probably only going to get to see the horse once. It's very unlikely that you're going to be able to do multiple visits. You're going to get to ride the horse. You're going to get the time to do a vet check, etc., etc. Most of these trainers just want to move the horses on, and there are plenty of people who are willing to take them. So odds are you're not going to get a very thorough time to meet, to greet, to learn a bit about the horse, to get to know them, etc. You're taking more of a gamble on that particular horse. So we need to kind of take that all into consideration, and we need to know, therefore, what is best for us. So I've already talked about the fact that more starts does not equal lame or insane. So taking the horse as they are and taking that into account for not only its possible downsides, but also its benefits. So when you are looking at a horse, when you're looking at any horse, this isn't just a racehorse, there's always going to be an aspect of needing to manage things, whether that's managing soundness or injuries or personality or whatever. There's always going to be something to manage. And so we need to be really realistic about what we are capable of improving and managing. So whether that's how much time we have, the resources we have, the support that we have, the experience that we have. So remembering that almost everything can be changed, and we know that the perfect horse doesn't exist. It doesn't matter where you're getting your horse from or what they're like, they're not going to be perfect. There's always things that we need to manage. There's always compromises whenever we're looking at a new horse. And so really being realistic about what your needs are, what your non-negotiables are, what you can work with and what you can't work with. And even asking the people around you to see if you're potentially a little bit skewed in that area, and whether those experienced and honest people around you can give you a bit more of an honest view on what your needs and your requirements actually are, and to bring that into a more realistic framework. So then when we get our racehorse, if we're getting them straight off the track, I personally believe in a letting down period. So a letting down period is basically where we turn the horse out and let them be a horse. So for me, sometimes I'll have a few rides before I do this. Honestly, for me, that's usually more out of curiosity than anything else, but certainly it can be something where you get to know the horse a little bit. It can actually be comforting for these horses because they are used to doing this work. And then I'm going to turn them out. So what that means for me is integrating them into a herd, which I do relatively carefully because, again, sometimes these horses do not have the best social skills. While they are turned out, I try to do really as little with them as I can. I really want them to just be able to be a horse. But in the background, I'm going to be working on rehabbing their gut, transitioning them over to the sort of feed that I want to have them on, taking them off those high grain, high energy feeds and into something that's more what I want to keep them on. I will also want to be addressing their hooves. So for me personally, that involves taking off their shoes and doing really regular trims so that they start to change the angles and change the quality of the hooves. For me, that means if they're going to be footsore, sometimes I'm going to put boots on them or something like that so that they can walk around comfortably. But that's just me. You can also keep shoes on them. For me, also, I'm going to do a little bit of body work right at the beginning of the letting down period and maybe a little bit at the end. But again, I'm trying to leave them alone as much as I can in the middle. But I do want to do a little bit to just set them up for success when they start again. So why we do this is basically so that they have the opportunity to make that transition into their new life. So I want to be able to do the work with their gut and with their feet without the pressure of working them. I want them to learn how to be a horse. I want them to relax and de-stress and learn how to be in a herd. And I want to be starting from more of a baseline than what I'm going to if they're straight out of racing. So I actually want them to lose that muscle. A lot of them will lose weight, and I don't freak out about that too much because they're going to put it back on in a more regular horse way rather than racehorse way. In terms of how long, it really depends on the horse. So for my horses, I've seen this be anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months. And it just depends on what that particular horse needs, how long it takes them to really get back to healthy, in good condition, to get their brain healthy, to get them into a better frame of mind. And also sometimes they do need that body work. They do need that rehab and that care to get their bodies more symmetrical to rehab an injury or to just set them up for soundness and success. So those are some of the things that I'll add on, is things like that gut rehab, the foot rehab, doing the body work, getting their teeth done. All of this is a really great time to do it while they're having this holiday. But again, I try to do a lot of it right at the beginning or right at the end so that they really do have that time to just be a horse without me fussing over them and doing very much with them. Okay, so how to train your racehorse. I kind of like this because it's like how to train your dragon. And this, again, is going to be true of any horse that we work with, but we're going to talk specifically about racehorses. So Be consistent. And this is honestly where most people struggle with the training of any horse, is just a lack of consistency. So what is okay one day is not okay the other day. We change and shift with our moods, with what people say, with the coach that we've gone to, with what we're thinking about, etc., etc. And so really being consistent, being clear, making it easy for your horse to understand. These horses are used to consistency, and horses honestly really thrive from consistency. Start where you are. So again, that's back to that knowing what your horse knows, what they don't know. And I personally start with what they do know and work from there. Learn to speak horse. And so I put this in here because horses are not humans. They don't think like humans. They don't learn like humans. They don't operate like humans, and we need to remember that they are actually a different species. And so this goes with the being consistent, but actually learning what makes sense to a horse, whether it makes sense to a human or not, and not assuming that what makes sense to a human makes sense to a horse. So for me personally, one of the things I actually love is there is a book called Horses Hate Surprise Parties. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. It's based on the principles of equitation science and research into how horses actually think, how they work, how they see the world, and how we can most effectively and calmly train them. And I really, really love that book. Then seek help early. So that is, again, supporting yourself with people who know what they're doing when it comes to retraining racehorses. So rather than blundering along in the dark at the beginning, I would rather that you got help really early in the process to give you a path, to give you a really good foundation, and then working from there. So rather than waiting until you have a problem, waiting until you are stuck, really getting ahead of it. So that's my main recommendation, especially if this isn't something you've done before, or maybe you have done it before and it hasn't worked out great. That's certainly what I'd be looking at. And then drown out the noise. And drown out the noise goes back to that being consistent, not letting everyone have an input into how you work with your horse and train your horse, but also not letting people get in your head with some of those myths about racehorses, about the problems you're going to have, about the things that are going to come up, to really just treat your horse as an individual, and day by day being curious about how your horse is on that particular day. So very, very quickly, and if you look at that book, it's going to come up, but I want to talk about the way that we train in general. So in general, we're using operant conditioning. So there are 4 parts of operant conditioning, which is positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. And I apologize because there is a typo on this slide. The one under positive reinforcement is supposed to be negative reinforcement. And that sucks because it's actually the most common one. So the most common one that we do use is negative reinforcement. So essentially, reinforcement just means that the horse does a behavior that we like, and we are going to do something that will make sure that they're likely to do that behavior again. Punishment essentially means that the horse does a behavior that we don't like, and we're going to do something to ensure that they don't do that behavior again. Now, here where we talk about negative and positive, we're not talking about good and bad. We're talking about adding and subtracting, which is why I've actually used the plus and the minus sign so that we can really remember that. So the idea with positive reinforcement is the horse does something that we like, and we add something to reward and reinforce that behavior. So that can be food, it can be a pat, it can be a word of praise. It can basically be anything where you are adding something to reinforce or to reward that behavior. Negative reinforcement would be when you are going to take something away in order to reward or reinforce that particular behavior. So this is where I say this is the main form of training we tend to use with horses. So the idea is we put our leg on, the horse goes forward, which is the behavior that we want, and then we take our leg off. Same as the horse steps forward, we take the pressure off the lead. We use our reins, the horse slows down, we take the pressure off the reins. And I want to note here that the most important part, the part where you are actually training your horse, is not putting the pressure on. It is the moment when we take the pressure off. And so the more quickly, the more consistently we do that, the quicker the horse is going to learn. Then we have positive punishment. So that's the horse does a behavior we don't like and we add something in order to discourage them from doing it in the future. So that can be growling at them. It can obviously be smacking them. It can be any form of punishment we like where we're actually doing something, adding something in order to deter the horse from doing it again. Then we have negative punishment, and negative punishment would be taking something away to discourage a poor behavior. So an example of this would be having a child that doesn't clean their room and taking away their iPhone, for example. So negative punishment doesn't work with horses. They don't function that way. They don't understand that. We should just never use it. It doesn't make sense to them. So if your horse kicks you and you take away their food, they do not put two and two together. They will not recognize that as a punishment. It will have zero effect on future behavior. So we just don't use it. So we want to stick to positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and positive punishment. And obviously, I would prefer that we aim more towards the negative reinforcement and possibly the positive reinforcement, depending on how you work. Personally, I use both of them, and I find that combining them helps the horse learn even faster. And I try to steer away from positive punishment as much as I possibly can. And instead, I personally focus on ways that I can set my horse up for success so that they're not giving me behaviors that I don't want. Or if they are, that they're giving me behaviors that I don't want, where I can just kind of be ignoring that until they work out the behavior that I do want. Okay. So I thought I'd add this little video in here, if it works, because this is the first ride on a horse of mine when he was 8 days off the track. So he raced 8 days prior to this video. He had all of those days off, and I had picked him up the day before this, and it might be too glitchy to really make this worthwhile. But what you could see is he walked off when I got on, and I did nothing to tell him off for that because that is the way that he's used to. In fact, he actually put up with me getting on using my stirrup and getting on from a log rather than being thrown on. And so to me, that's really great. I want it to be noted, I didn't lunge this horse before I got on. I did use the reins while I was on the ground to just check that stop and turn was going to work, but I really did absolutely nothing else prior to getting on. The other thing I want to note here is that sometimes he does do that reach down, lean down, and I'm purposely softening my reins so that he's not getting into that pattern, which, as we've discussed, they're actually taught, which is to then lean on the reins. What I want is for him to essentially have really, really soft reins so that all I'm using them for is to stop and to turn and not encouraging him to lean on them. This is the first ride. I'm not trying to fix anything. So there I did use the reins and he leaned against it and all of that, but he did stop. And so I took the pressure off and I patted him. So yeah, in this ride, I'm not trying to fix anything. I'm not even really trying to train him to do anything. All I want in this particular ride is to get the feel of him, to get a basic idea of how he goes, but also really just for him to get a bit of confidence with me riding him, to see this particular arena. And it's just a getting to know you ride. I'm not trying to teach him anything. I'm not trying to get him to go any particular way. I'm just setting him up so that I can really find out how he is. So hence you can see that there is basically no contact. It's just short of my reins flapping in the breeze. So it's really not an exciting thing. When I want him to turn, I'm going to be super clear about that. This particular horse raced in Brisbane, so I know that he spent the majority of his time going right, going clockwise. If he was in Melbourne, it would have been the opposite. There he had a little spook, that's fine. Go back to steering. So I expect him to go a little better on the right than I do on the left. I would expect him to be a bit more balanced, particularly when it comes to canter, and I would expect him to find it easier to pick up the right canter lead compared to the left. So knowing these sorts of things, this is where we can have a bit of a clue. Because our horses raced, we have a clue of which side they're going to go better. So there you can see he picked up canter quite happily. Oh gosh, this video is terrible. But You can see here that I'm going to try and stay in 2-point position, so off his back. I'm just going to let him canter along. I might do the odd, slow down because we're in an arena and it's a bit tighter than on the track, but I'm not really doing much. And you can see here, kind of, that the left canter's a bit bigger, it's a bit less balanced, the steering's a bit harder, and what I did cut out was that it took us a number of goes to actually get left canter, where right canter was quite immediate. So there's an idea of how a first ride can go. This is how relaxed it can actually be. This horse then trotted on a loose rein, then walked on a loose rein. So again, this idea of, they're going to be silly, they're going to be hot, they're going to be flighty, they're going to be whatever. He really wasn't. And knowing how he was trained meant that I could ride him in a way that made sense to him and set us up for success. So knowing about keeping my reins soft so he wasn't going to lean on them, knowing about which way he was more likely to want to go, so purposely picking up that canter first rather than waiting until doing that second. So purposely setting him up so that the lead I thought might be harder was the lead he was picking up second. Letting him move off while I got on, I'm not going to teach that to him right away. Yes, it is 100% my expectation of them later that they will stand still while I get on. The first day, the first few rides, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to start with what they know. I'm going to get them comfortable with that. And then gradually, I'm going to add in bits of training that tell them what I want. Okay, so some sticking points that people get to is competition. So taking these horses out for the first time when there are other horses going along, being ridden, yes, of course. The only time that they've been taken out where other horses are being ridden is either to do track work or to race. And so when you add in competition where there's nerves, where there might be speakers, things like that, they're probably going to assume that they are racing. They're highly likely to be stressed. So if I'm going to set them up for success, I actually personally want to get them straight off the truck or off the float and do something with them right away. So I actually find that these horses, if you just try and tie them and leave them at the float, like we often are told to do, it actually tends to make them more anxious because it's like standing there waiting for a race. I find that these horses so often actually calm down when we put a saddle on them. Obviously, I would have wanted to do some work with them beforehand, but again, I'm going to get there and I'm going to recognize, okay, he's probably not going to stand still. He's probably not going to stand still when I get on. And I'm going to be a little bit lenient about that. So for me, what my ideal is that I would get there, almost immediately saddle him up, get on him, and even just walk and trot around my float or my car or my truck, even just walking around and literally just going and stopping and steering. And I'm staying near the truck so that it's somewhere that's non-threatening to him. It's something that he's already comfortable with. And then I'll get off. And then if I'm going to ride him later, then I'll ride him later. But 9 times out of 10, I find that they just instantly relax after they've had that little ride because they've done something. They're not waiting for a race. They're not standing in cross ties waiting to race, getting more and more and more stressed. So for me, that's been the biggest thing that I've ever done to just take all the stress out of that situation. And then, recognizing that, going around in a group with other horses moving and things like that is going to be a bit stressful for them. And so understanding that, going back to that consistent training that I've already done, and being understanding that, maybe standing still is not going to go well that day. So rather than asking for it and getting into an argument, I'm just a bit lenient. I walk and I trot and I canter and I trot. And to be honest, I do a lot of trot because I find that walking can sometimes be stressful. And rather than having an argument, doing stuff in trot where I get to practice my go and my stop and my turn and reinforce the training I've been doing and get the horse to feel like they're getting it right. Focus on that positive and negative reinforcement and get them to the point where I'm so consistent that I become the comforting part of their life. I become the constant, even though their surroundings and the horses and the atmosphere has changed. Floating. So, like I said, most of these horses know how to get on and off a truck. Some of them know how to get on and off a float. Contrary to popular belief, there are actually a lot of race trainers that float their horses as well. Floating is one of the big ones, and I'm not going to go into it in too much detail because of the limited time. But let me just say that floating is, again, using positive and negative reinforcement to teach the horse to walk onto a float. Rather than expecting them to walk onto a float, rather than dragging them, rather than anything else, you're going to teach the horse to walk onto the float. So for me personally, I use those principles with the equitation science from that Horses Hate Surprise Party books is the best summary of it. And I teach the horse how to get on the float. I teach them, I help them, I set them up for success, and I make sure that it's a calm experience, it's an easy experience, and it's broken down into really small parts. Again, there's a whole lot more detail on that, and you're welcome to reach out to me. I have entire programs on that, and I help people with this a lot. Group lessons. So group lessons are going to be a lot like that competition thing. So the horses moving around is going to be a lot like, okay, we're doing track work or we're going out to race. So again, going back to those consistent basics and setting them up for success in terms of not asking for something they're just not capable of doing on that particular day. And at the same time, though, not necessarily expecting that they will be silly, because sometimes I think we create a self-fulfilling prophecy by assuming that my racehorse is going to struggle when it goes out to a competition, when it goes to a group lesson. Again, that curiosity of that particular horse on that particular day. And you might get there and they might be the quietest horse there. And I've had that more times than I can count, where they've just gotten there and fallen asleep. Okay, then we have separation anxiety, then being grumpy, spooky, flighty, etc. So these things are all stuff that we can work with. And again, some horses are going to be more predisposed than others. The majority of the grumpy, spooky, flighty, I find, goes with the letting down period when we help out their gut and their body, and also just letting them be a horse, and then with that consistent training as well. Separation anxiety, I just want to make a note on this. There are certainly things we can do to lessen the behaviors, but one of the most heartbreaking things that I heard, and it really sticks with me, is that every single horse has separation anxiety. We can measure stress hormones in their body when their friends are taken away and prove that every horse experiences separation anxiety. We just don't call it that until it comes out in a behavior that we find problematic. And so for me personally, rather than trying to prevent or punish separation anxiety, for me, I work to understand it and to put my horses in positions where they're not having to really suffer separation anxiety. There are exceptions to that where, they have access to particular horses, they can touch, they can do everything like that, and they're instead still getting really upset about one particular horse. And then, yes, I will work with that. I will work with behaviors to make them more manageable, but I don't see this as a vice. I remember that every single horse actually experiences it, whether we see it or not. And so for me personally, I try not to put any of my horses in that position where they are the only horse, where everyone else has been taken away from them. And so on. There are other ones as well, but we don't really have the time to go into them here. So, as I've just said, because this is a limited talk, I have limited time to go into this. I have some free resources on my website. So the website is retrainingracehorses.com.au. And if you go to the /Art of the Horseman page, you'll find some additional resources here, some videos, some articles, things like that, going into some of those sticking points, etc. I also do have an online program. So again, it's that retrainingracehorses.com.au/online. So this is a really comprehensive program. So it's essentially what we've just done, but times about 50 lessons. So it's everything from that choosing a racehorse, training your racehorse, getting them home, letting them down, how we can work with problem behaviors, how we can set them up for success, how you would teach them very particular things, etc., etc., etc. It's really super, super detailed, and it is part of that aim of mine to teach people how to retrain their racehorses, how to work with them in the future, how to make sure that we're setting them up for success, how to have the best time you can possibly have with your off-the-track horse. Because again, I really believe that where horses and racehorses in particular get into poor circumstances where they end up in really awful places and really awful conditions is from that middle home between racing and between whatever condition they've ended up in. And so that is my personal mission, is to prevent that happening in the future. So as well as in-person programs, as well as working with people one-on-one, either in person or remotely, the online program is really something I'm very, very proud of. So I would love if you would check it out and see what you think. On social media, it is at Retraining Racehorses, at Retraining Racehorses Oz, and that is on Facebook only. And I have another typo. This is terrible. So it is Retraining Racehorses Oz. The next one is going to be wrong. So again, my website, retrainingracehorses.com.au, at Retraining Racehorses AUS, not as it is there. For bodywork and rehab and my coaching and various other things, in case you want to have a look at that, we have Synergy and Freedom, or oneword.com, or at Synergy and Freedom on Facebook or Instagram. So have fun, enjoy your horse off the track, enjoy the process, set yourself and your horse up for success. And honestly, it doesn't have to be stressful. It doesn't have to be hard. It doesn't have to be all of those things that the myths will tell us it's going to be. It just doesn't have to be. So I hope you have a wonderful time with your horses. I hope you enjoy the rest of this fair, because I'm super excited to see some of the other presentations. And thank you so much for watching this video.